Discover what I would say is a new emotion in recent Japanese history, solidarity, as part of claiming recognition for themselves as human beings entitled to being treated with dignity like any other human being.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Japan-America Society program this evening titled What's Happening to Japanese Workers? And it's a long title. It's a fascinating presentation by Dr. Norma Field. Before I introduce her, let me just say a few words about the society. We are the oldest bilateral society or organization in Chicago that promotes both understanding and friendship between Japan and the United States. Let me just ask, how many people are members right now? Oh, great. A lot of members. Just a few non-members. If you're not a member, one of our co-chairs of the membership committee, Mr. Greg Merkley, is here.
To take your effort.
Please, yes, please speak to him.
Remind me to leave.
If you're, yes, please speak to him after the program. Let me just introduce Dr. Norma Field. She is the Robert S. Ingersoll Distinguished Professor of Japanese Studies at the University of Chicago. Robert S. Ingersoll, probably very few of you remember him. He was an ambassador to Japan, I believe, in the 70s. She is an author of many books about Japan, one titled The Splendor of Longing in the Tale of Genji, as well as In the Realm of a Dying Emperor. And recently, I think her first book in Japanese, titled, in Japanese, Kobayashi Takiji, 21世紀にどう読むか. The English title being Reading Kobayashi Takiji for the 21st Century. And you see his book there. I brought my copy. You can see this is a book published in 1929 by the Japanese author Kobayashi Takiji. And you all saw the program notes, so I will now turn it over to Dr. Field for her wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Ken, for your introduction. Thank you, all of you, for inviting me to speak at this oldest of the Japan-America societies in the U.S. And this is a topic that's very dear to my heart, but one that is still unfolding. I'm neither an economist, obviously, nor a labor historian, but in a sense, work is something that involves all of us, that concerns all of us. And the possibility of working is also a very serious issue for everybody in the world today. I think even those of us who are lucky enough to have stable employment. So I'm hoping that I can share some of what's been going on in Japan over the past year and even earlier. And we can talk about it later. I'm not going to speak directly to the new administration that came into office in September of this year, although that's a very exciting thing. But I hope that those of you who have questions or want to know how the change of regime might impact these issues will raise these as questions or as comments later at the end of my talk. So I have up here what I've labeled two images from 2008. One is of the book, the best-known book by my author that I wrote a book about in Japanese this year. First published, as Ken said, in 1929, and utterly unexpectedly a bestseller in 2008. It has two translations in English right now, one that was done quite early, in the early 30s, and then one done later in the 1980s. I know someone who's produced a new translation, so I'm hoping we might get a very a fluid, fresh one soon. It's certainly a work that deserves that. It's called The Cannery Ship in the earlier version and The Factory Ship in the second. But this is the stack, the shocking stack of this old bestseller in a bookstore sometime last year. And at the end of the year, you see the year-end dispatch workers. Well, it's actually the year-end to the New Year's non-regular workers, whatever term you want to use, if there's a fixed term in Japanese, haken roudosha, who had been cut off from their jobs at the end of the year. And since so much dispatch labor comes with dormitories, for example, it meant that they were also thrown out of a place to stay at the end of the year. The end of the year is also the time when government offices close down, and therefore they didn't have places to go to make their appeals on unemployment offices like Halowaku and such. A variety of organizations, maybe 30, who have involved themselves with issues of homelessness and temp labor came together to host this village, which is right in Hibiya Park, as you know, in the heart of Tokyo, adjacent to the Imperial Palace and major financial structures, not far from government offices. And in fact, this village was pitched, the tent village was pitched under the nose of the labor ministry. So it was very obvious to people who when they came back to work, what was going on. The purpose was to give, in the first instance, shelter to those who were deprived of it at the end of the year, to give people camaraderie, companionship for greeting the end of the year and the new year. As you know, that's a terribly important time in Japan. Welcome, all of you. I'm just at the beginning, still talking about these images, and also to give advice and concrete kinds of advice of what they can do, where they could go to the minute government offices opened in the new year. I believe that the village itself numbered the inhabitants 300 or so, somewhere around there, and many times as many villagers came in the form of volunteers. So what was interesting about this experiment was also that it made manifest a hunger on the part of many, many Japanese who were more fortunate to do something to address the urgent issue of their time. So I think very, very important issue. And I've since learned in the follow-up reporting that's done on this village how a number of people said, had they not learned about this, they would have committed suicide, because what were they going to do to greet the new year? So, okay, that's one image to keep with you for this talk. And then secondly, two people. I call them leaders/representatives because we're always tempted to identify individuals and determine the worth of any endeavor by the prominence, the effectiveness, the power accrued by its leaders. And I think both of these figures would be very reluctant to be identified that way, that what is so terribly important for each of them is the fact that they belong to a movement and they're contributing their labors to a movement. On the left is my writer, Kobayashi Takiji, born 1903 and died and killed by the police in 1933. He was only a little bit past his 29th birthday at that time. He was a leader of the literary wing of the Proletarian Movement. Proletariat is a word not so familiar, certainly in American English today, very familiar in European languages, and very familiar in Japanese from a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago. I'll be referring to this movement off and on throughout my talk, but in a word, it's a worldwide movement, an international movement inspired by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, where people around the world understood that the terrible plight, the expropriation of labor in very brutal ways, often in the process of industrialization around the world was one that didn't have to simply be tolerated. That seeing something work somewhere, i.e. in the Soviet Union, inspired many, many people in Europe, in the United States, and certainly in Asia as well. And they kept in touch with each other. The Japanese members of the movement, many of them were very good at languages. They'd had the best education of their day. Many of them were graduates of Tokyo Imperial University. My writer was from Hokkaido, graduate of Otaru Higher Commercial School. And it might interest those of you who are in business in this room that it was precisely from going to the commercial school that, first of all, he was able to develop his literary interests and talents. He found a lot of other like-minded young men. And it was because the commercial school emphasized foreign language study. How can you hope to succeed in business, in trade, in commerce if you didn't speak the languages of your partners? Because they specialized or put such an emphasis on foreign language education, the school had attracted many young men who were actually interested in foreign literature. And they also had a good supply of foreign instructors to begin with. It was a very cosmopolitan institution, the premier liberal arts education, in fact, where the discipline of economics was being invented in Japan as much as elsewhere, and much more of a liberal arts school than what would become Hokkaido University, because that started dedicated to another very important endeavor, namely agriculture. So he was increasingly became interested in workers and tenant farmers movements. He was at the same time an aspiring writer. He felt that there was a role for literature in this revolutionary movement. He had many comrades in that belief, sharing that belief. And he did end up being handed over by a spy to the police in 1933 and was tortured to death within 3 hours of his capture. And his example was made a great deal of. I'll come back to that later. Now, on your right, or on the right hand of the screen, is Amamiya Karin. How many of you know about her, have ever heard of her? Nobody? Amamiya Karin. Well, she started out as a singer in a right-wing punk rock band. And she's from Hokkaido also. She's only a high school graduate. She was a pretty alienated young woman, you might guess. She was a wrist cutter and so forth. I think all of this past experience has been very useful, what she's become. She began to question rightist interpretations of Japanese history and wartime history over the past decade in the 21st century. But it's really, she says, only with Prime Minister Koizumi's victory in what I call Japan's 9/11, that is to say the election, the lower house election of September 11th, 2005, that she began to question many of what she had, much of the common sense that had been passed off at the time, began to inform herself about economics and society in general. She took on what in Japan is Japanese is called the precariato. It's a neologism from Italian, where in Italian itself it's a neologism from proletariat and precarity, that is to say, to think about those who are precariously employed today. No stability, and therefore no stability in terms of jobs, and therefore no stability in terms of housing, food, etc. And precariato is a word that's really come into Japanese, and I was realizing doing a bit more internet research today that it seems to be quite established as a term in German, in French, in Italian, I suspect in Spanish too. And I was reading about a paper of a political scientist at our neighboring University of Michigan talking about American exceptionalism. Why has this term not come into the United States when certainly that kind of precarious labor situation is not unfamiliar here? and the whole notion that having a word makes a world of difference. Having a word makes a world of difference in whether a person can grasp her or his situation in the world. And so that's something to think about. She has led many demonstrations, many kinds of actions of these workers. She's also, I think, become sort of a one-woman rescue mission. I shouldn't say one woman because she's tied up with other people involved in this kind of work. So if you read her blog, which I should say is also part of the Article 9, the No War Clause movement blog, so she's also tied in with the peace movement, and that's another thing I'd like to get to today is how to join the economic justice and the peace movements. You will see that she's often writing from her experiences of being contacted by someone who is saying, I've been at an internet cafe for a week, I don't have a single yen on me, I can't leave, so I'm thinking of hanging myself. And this is a fairly recent posting on her blog. And she said, so I dashed over there and found him, and he had actually set up a rope in the what do you call them? The stall that he had rented at the internet cafe. And so she felt she'd gotten there just in the nick of time. And this kind of thing seems to be a fairly, regrettably recent experience for her. So what I want to do tonight, let me backtrack a minute. She's actually directly connected to the revival of Kobayashi Takeji's most famous work. She had been reading it in order to participate in a discussion for publication for a journal, and suddenly, this would be in January of 2008, had grasped its immediacy for the present era, and she did an interview with an established novelist, Takahashi Geiichiro, I think, and that was published in the Mainichi, and that attracted a whole lot of attention. And then that was referred to in an Asahi column in February, and so that was part of getting the boom going. So an actual connection as well as many shared sympathies between these two. So what I'd like to do, what I hope to do with you tonight is both to inform you of some of the ways in which people have been living the economic statistics we've been seeing in the news, and particularly the way in which Japan, the name Japan was deployed in the news last fall, in the course of what Japanese call Lehman shock, with defaulting of our major financial institutions, how Japan was always summoned as a kind of counterexample, like this is what will happen if we don't intervene actively enough. So how have people been living that? Some people call it the lost decade. Seems to be, it's a long decade. But not just to inform you of that, but especially to share with you the ways in which these people, and especially the young, since they have been hurt disproportionately, have learned to identify the character of their new situation, and discover what I would say is a new emotion in recent Japanese history, solidarity, as part of claiming recognition for themselves as human beings entitled to being treated with dignity like any other human being. So, let's take a look at this. I want to talk a bit now about how these two, the 1920s and early 30s movement and the 21st century movement, come together in the revival of this novel. Let me say a bit about the novel itself. On the left is the ship, it's an actual ship that is one of the models for the novel itself. This is this kind of fishing industry, I should say, the crab canning industry. The crab cannery ship is a fuller translation of the title. The crab canning business was a very, very important one for Japan in the 1920s, and it was the major conglomerates of Tokyo were involved in it. It took place in contestation with the Soviet Union. The ships therefore often violated Soviet territorial waters, and for that reason, they were accompanied at not great distance by the Imperial Navy. Also, what is really important about this form of fishing is that the crabs would be caught by small boats. It was very precarious, cold, as you can imagine, cold northern waters in the wintertime. So small boats would actually catch the crabs. The crabs would be brought to the mothership and canned on the spot to maximize their freshness. And therefore, the ships were considered, they were both a factory and they were fishing vessels, but they were neither, was the way the corporations that owned them treated them. Therefore, they were subject neither to international maritime law, nor were they subject to factory law and its regulations, which meant that those who worked on these ships had no legal protection whatsoever for their conditions of labor. And that was the brilliant part of it in terms of from the corporation's point of view, and the disastrous part of it for the workers. And at the time, in 1926, 27, 28, a number of these ships were in the news for forms of labor abuse that really amounted to torture that were exposed and written up in Hokkaido newspapers primarily. And there was a particularly notorious incident where one ship sending distress signals to another in its area was left to sink. And the reasoning there was that for the ship's owner of the vessel that allowed the other vessel to sink said that for the owners of the ship to get the insurance money on that ship was much more important than having it rescued. It's a very old ship anyway. Many of these ships were hospital ships from the Russo-Japanese War that had been re-outfitted for this purpose, so they were not in very good shape. The point was to eke out as much profit as possible from these ships. So this is the kind of historical actual example that my writer was working off. He did a great deal of research interviewing people who actually worked on these ships off Hakodate, which was the main port for this kind of fishing. The people who worked on these vessels were seasonal workers. They could be seasonal farm workers in the summer, and then in wintertime they had nothing else to do, so they boarded these ships. The first line of this novel is very famous. It's roughly, they say we're going to hell, mate. And then we are taken to their hell. They're divided by the nature of their work because you have the crew that are expert about sailing, you have the fishermen who are expert about fishing, and then you have the factory hands who are trained to engage in the really quite nasty work of cleaning the crabs and canning them, of that kind of repetitive labor. So these are people who are not, who have no reason to stick up for each other. They are divided by their work, as I said, and also they are constantly driven to compete with each other by management. And it's only after some of their comrades die that they decide to stage an uprising, which fails because even though they succeed in locking the director and the ship's captain in their quarters, and they think they've triumphed, they actually didn't take over the communications part of the vessel. So an SOS has been signaled to the Imperial Navy, and the Imperial Navy comes and they say, oh, there is our Navy. They've come to help us. But instead, the members of the Navy had their bayonets out, and the soldiers, those who were the leaders of the uprising were captured, and it failed quite abysmally, quite tragically. The two lessons they gathered from that was, one, that the Imperial Navy was not there to protect us, that it was there to protect the owners of the ship and their interests. And secondly, we can't have leaders. We have to, every single one of us, be part of it. that our having leaders that we named and identified was our and their undoing. Important part of, there are very important lines in this novel, which is a novel that Kobayashi Takeshi attempted to write without any heroes. No individual heroes, but to write a novel showing a collectivity, which is pretty hard for novel writing. But anyway, one of the observations in there is that there aren't, the individuals, like the brutal, demon-like director is not our enemy. We have to, what is important for us is to learn the nature of our enemy. Who's our enemy? The bankers in Tokyo. Sorry, bankers on the audience. The bankers in Tokyo, global imperialism, and the imperial military. If we don't look at the structures that are seeking to exploit our labor, then we'll make a mistake. And in fact, when the ship comes back to Hakodate, the director himself, first of all, he's fired by the company because he let this mutiny take place. And he himself is made to recognize his own having been simply a pawn. So we see the two early editions. This was a bestseller, even though it was printed serially twice in an organ, that is to say, a movement journal, and the second half was banned. Even so, it was circulated and sold very well. Kobayashi Takeshi got money out of his writings, and his movement made money off it. Even though the texts are very heavily censored. Almost all of his writing before the war is heavily censored, lots of X's and dots, and when you see lines, notations like 64 lines omitted, you wonder at the dedication of the people who would read such texts, and they were often in the mainstream journals of the day, like Chuo Koron, some of you may know, which still exists, or Kaizo. As I say, he was caught by the police and tortured to death in 3 hours. If you think about that time, 3 hours, I think it's kind of important because they weren't seeking information from him, right? Otherwise, you would be very careful not to torture your captive so quickly as to kill him. At the same time, they weren't interested in simply killing him because then you would just use your pistol. I think the 3 hours had something to do with needing to enjoy the suffering of your captive. It is said that the secret higher police had been after him ever since he published a novella in 1928 about a national roundup of union workers, all kinds of people, some intellectual leaders, but often longshoremen and the like. And there was widespread torture that was used, and in a sense, I think that work is one of the classics of world torture literature, if you can imagine such a genre. It's very hard, I think you can imagine, to verbally represent torture, both externally and then from the viewpoint of the person who's being tortured. Anyhow, this is the wake that was held by his comrades. People who tried to attend his funeral or mark his as deceased in any way were uniformly arrested. And this was used as a very, very powerful weapon on the part of the state to say, do you want to end up like him? For anyone engaging in this kind of movement or refusing to renounce their views. So, one of the famous photographs from pre-war Japan. Two films. Very important film from 1953 by Yamamura So, which he financed himself, and he writes about how he had to take on all these boring, endless home dramas after that, playing one, bamboozled dad after another in order to pay off the expenses of this film. But it became quite a famous movie. It has a very tragic ending, which the novella does not. The novella has a postscript that says, and they rose again, and this time they succeeded. But in this one, it's a much bleaker ending. The Imperial Navy comes, and everybody's shot and killed on the decks. And I've been talking to some friends about this. Why was this film made in 1953 with such a bleak ending? And one possibility, which seems really the only plausible one to me, because why would you make a movement that's very challenging anyway seem so hopeless? And it seems like one way to think about it is Japan was rearming at that time. It was just come out from under the U.S. occupation, and the U.S. Was encouraging it to rearm. There was the police force that was the beginning of today's self-defense forces. We have, I don't remember quite what month, but you'll soon have Pacific atomic testing, the Korean War, so forth and so on. So that bleak final ending to this movie may well have been a kind of protest to what was going on in the early 50s rather than what happened in the 30s. And I just stuck up there the film that was shown in the Chicago Film Festival. Did anyone see it? Yeah? Good. I went to Tokyo as it happened, so I couldn't see it, but by Sabu, whom those of you who know is not a director interested in any of these ideological issues, so very interesting for that reason too. I am eager to see it myself, but put it up there. I should say that the U.S. Army was greeted as an army of liberation by communists and other leftists who had been left in jail by the state. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that the occupying army had a kind of reception that subsequent history would make it hard to imagine. And even though, as many of you know, the reverse course, that is to say, the U.S. occupation priority changed quickly from democratizing Japan and punishing those who had been responsible for the oppressive emperor state of the pre-war and war era, to turning Japan into a secure ally for American geopolitics in that area. Even though that reverse course set in early, there are many, many ways in which the occupation was experienced as liberatory, certainly in education, also for labor movement. It is true that a general strike that was scheduled for February 1st, 1947 was canceled at the very last minute by General MacArthur. And thereafter, many labor leaders the rightists of the war period come out of jail, and labor leaders get sent to jail, and the communist paper is shut down, so forth and so on. People who were collecting signatures for the Stockholm Appeal, which was an appeal condemning the first use of nuclear weapons, that many such people were detained also. So it's in that atmosphere, I think, that both there was a great interest in Kobayashi Takeji and the works of his comrades after the war, and you could have a movie. His novel was staged many times. I should also say that it was translated into multiple languages already in the 1930s, not just English, but other languages. Certainly Chinese was an early translated language. It continues to be translated. In fact, a French translation just appeared. So its revival seems to mean perhaps an international revival as well. In any case, it was of interest, I would say, up to about 1970. Now, what happens in that period? First of all, the major post-war collective action, which was the protest of the renewal of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty in 1960. I don't have the image here with me, but many of you will seen the image of the Diet building, the parliament encircled, because so many people came out, and this happened all over Japan. This was students and union types and leftists of various kinds, but also many ordinary citizens, workers coming out from work, mothers with their babies, so forth and so on, to say we don't want to be under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. We want to truly be independent. The treaty was renewed, as you know, but during that, the size of that treaty, of the protest, I think, was alarming enough. And what happens is that then Prime Minister Kishi quits. Shortly thereafter is replaced by Prime Minister Ikeda, who instituted a brilliant plan. It was called the Income Doubling Plan, Shotoku Baizo Keikaku. And this was enormously powerful, as you can imagine, a program whose goal is to double the income of every citizen. And I think that was hugely effective in channeling citizen interest from politics to economics, and particularly the situation of their own homes. This is really when the Japanese economy, the economic miracle, is consolidated, when people come to think of themselves as Japanese, and being Japanese came to mean being middle class. It's a nation of middle class consumers. That's what you were first and foremost as a citizen, a middle class consumer. From here and through the bubble years, the largest percentages of that fabled institution called lifetime employment, it's a misnomer, it's long-term employment, and lifetime employment really never covered the majority, even close to the majority of workers at its best. It was mostly a practice of the largest firms, and at the highest rates, from what I can find now, 66 to 70%. In small and middle-sized firms, it was never even 50% of the workers at its best. Nevertheless, the economy was expanding, and so despite many, many problems from the 60s through the 70s and even the 80s, and by problems I mean the highly competitive education system, all the problems that we all know about bullying, school refusal, I think those were really important symptomatic problems during the successful years of post-war Japan. And then particularly from the 80s, the whole problem of death from overwork syndrome, karoshi. Despite those phenomena, it seemed to be enough people, the majority of Japanese seemed to be economically secure enough. It was also a time of privatization. Probably the major victory in that line being the privatization of the Japan National Railways, and therefore a period when labor unions came to seem less and less relevant to anybody's life. Let's take a look. So, this unexpected thing, now people had begun to talk about the kaksa. This happened not long after Prime Minister Koizumi's second victory in 2005 of an unequal society in terms of income. Other terms that became very popular, working poor, walking poor, as I said, precariato, those terms were all coming out. And then in 2008, and officially in May of that year, that's when Yomiuri Shimbun featured it on its internet news, this novel comes to be revived, and this worker, Hasegawa Emi, who works in a bookstore in Ueno, saw these newspaper articles I referred to earlier and ordered 150 copies of this book from Shinchosha, the same edition that Ken just showed us at the beginning. And the publisher, Shinchosha, were so astonished to get an order of 150 copies that they began to check into the sales of this book all over the country and found out that sure enough there seemed to be something surprising going on all over the country. And Ms. Hasegawa made this little handwritten sign, say, working poor. And then, could it be that what we're all on is a crab cannery ship? This became a very famous sales pitch for this book. And the book goes on, I think, within 2008, this company alone printed 500,000 copies. So a totally forgotten book from the prosperous years and the years of depoliticization. I haven't skipped over 1968-69 for now, well, in the interest of time. But so from a book that had been totally not just forgotten, but in many ways despised. So I was telling one of you before the talk, I began to work on this writer about 5 years ago, and I knew that I was working on a topic that was simultaneously unfashionable and controversial. And it took me a long time to decide to do it because, why do you want to to be doing something that no one was interested in and would question your sanity in doing it, but something that's simultaneously controversial. Why? Because he died as a member of the Communist Party. And so in that sense, new leftists from the late 60s and 70s don't like the communists, so new leftists don't like him. All the conservatives don't like him. And so in that sense, unfashionable and conservative, and there his book is enjoying this extraordinary revival. There's an essay contest that targeted people up to the age of 25, because that's the age Takeshi was when he wrote this book. And that was one division, had a very handsome prize. What was it? I think it was 50 man, 500,000 yen for the top prize, 300,000 for the second. And then there was a second internet division where there was no age limit. The winning entry was by a woman aged 25 who worked for one of these unions, which is a part of my talk tonight. In this age of irregular employment, conventional labor unions are not of much use. And what have come into being are these unions that you can join as a single entity. In fact, I think the regulation is that if you have two people, you can have a union. And what's the point of having a union like that? Well, first of all, you have certain rights. And usually it's not just two people. If there are two of you, you're going to persuade others to join in. And you engage in collective bargaining. Collective bargaining means that if someone wants to complain to his or her company, you have everybody in that union who's free at that hour coming with you and coming to those fancy headquarters, a motley group of people. And usually headquarters people don't like that. And so there's a fair amount of tactile, palpable pressure exerted just by the presence of such people. So this woman, having read the novel, says, yes, there are all these similarities, the irregularity of the work, the abusiveness, the physical abusiveness of our labor, and sexual harassment, commonplace. Says, but the one difference is they were on a boat. They were stuck in one space together. They could organize. The nature of temp labor is that we all scatter. So how is it that we could rise again like those people? That was the question she posed. Very important question at the end of her essay. One of the winning entries in the internet division was from someone who submitted from Internet Cafe, clearly didn't have enough money to buy paper for himself, so he just used the free cover sheets at that Internet Cafe, signed by his initials. It took a long time for the organizers to find him to deliver the prize money. It never succeeded in doing so, but just found his sister because he's engaged in seasonal labor in factories. But his was a kind of poem, and there was a line I couldn't forget in it, which was, you don't have to be hung, suspended over the cold seas of Kamchatka like the crab cannery ship workers were, but if you're washing high-rise windows and your rigging breaks, you might as well be over Kamchatka in the winter, because you're going to die. And just before I left Chicago at that time to participate in judging the essay contest, there's a big article in the New York Times about 3 people, 2 were brothers and 1 was just a comrade, colleague, fellow worker, whose rigging had indeed broken and had fallen from, they were cleaning a 36th floor window in Manhattan, and 2 died instantly, and 1 of them survived, and a year later had survived 18 surgeries. And it struck me very much about how we live so close, right? There's only a panel of glass separating the person who is at risk of crashing to his death and the one who is maybe not enjoying his or her work, but is securely inside. So that whole question of how do we come to practice and feel for and engage in solidarity. Yes, okay, some of the hard times. You may remember the Akihabara incident where a worker who had just lost his temp situation drove a truck into that very crowded district. The pictures are very strange. It's hard to get a sense of what that must have felt like. He drove a truck in, and I think killed 2 people through the truck and then injured 6 others, something like that. Then he came out with a knife and stabbed a number of people, killed 2 more, injured a number of others. That sort of became a very important episode, signaling the nature, the desperation of people in these conditions of work. And suicide rates. It is thought now that this year's suicide rate might equal or exceed the previous high, which is 2003, 34,000. Suicide rates are notoriously unreliable because we only know the ones who succeeded. Many suicides go unreported, as you may know, because the family of the suicide will not get the insurance money from their deceased family members. So there's a lot of guesswork that goes into suicide statistics. Japan is very high. I was just looking at World Health Organization figures this morning, and the top 6 or 7 are all countries from the former Soviet Union. I think Lithuania was the top right now. And right after that comes Japan. I hear that Korea recently overtook Japan as the highest suicide country after the former Soviet bloc nations. It's about half of what takes place in the U.S. The U.S. does not come up very high. Another interesting statistic, I think, that probably requires analysis. What is it about this kind of work? As probably most of you know, Japan has been deregulating labor and opening up more and more sectors of employment to temporary and dispatch work. And 2004, people point to as a very major watershed year where the manufacturing sector was opened up to dispatch labor. And a very famous documentary aired in NHK in 2005, the following year, saying that there were 1 million freezers who were working in this form in the manufacturing sector. And it was a very, very bleak documentary, fascinating because it followed these workers from their dormitories to their workplace. One of the most interesting things in that documentary was this fact. I think we all think of machines having entered, with industrialization, having entered the workplace to save on human labor, to eliminate progressively the need for human labor, to make things faster, perhaps more uniformly. And one of the things that came up in this NHK documentary was that in some cases now humans are even cheaper than machines. The example here was manufacture of cell phones. Cell phones, in competition with China, Japanese cell phone manufacturers are always having to change one or another tiny feature, right? But you have to keep changing, always produce a new product on the market. And in order to do so, it was determined that rather than produce the machines to make the tiny new adjustments, it was cheaper to use human beings. So this is, I think, an extraordinary page in the history of, in history, and certainly in the history of industrialization, where humans can be deemed to replace machines in that way. On the one hand, and on the other hand, it is also the case that machines have been replacing human beings. So I read the case, for example, where family restaurants, aka famiresu, now can exist without human beings. So you have those touch screen panels and you put in your orders. And so what are we saying? Fewer and fewer places for people to work, and where you do work, you might be assigned to a position where you are deemed to be less than a machine. I was trying to think about an equivalent for this brilliant situation with the cannery ship, where because they're neither factory nor fishing vessel, the workers receive no protection from any sort of law. And I think the equivalent of that probably could be something like what's called false subcontracting, where companies will send out workers in effect as temp workers, but giving them the official status of subcontractors. The difference I'm finally beginning to grasp is that no one is responsible. The company sending out the workers is not responsible, has no idea what the work conditions are on the ground in such a place, and the people and the factory, the dispatch conditions also don't know, saying it's not our responsibility. So these workers, again, fall through the cracks. Again, this kind of thing is beginning to get attention, and their court cases are being won to start governing this, to crack down on it. What are other kinds of things? The name-only management types, the people who are hired as temp workers and get hourly wages, some cases as bad as 800 or 900 yen, now what, $7 and something, but are assigned to become managers. So they have all the responsibility of management, none of the benefits, no security, no benefit, and a prime case for inviting death from overwork for yourself. That kind of thing is now getting a lot of attention too. Okay, why has it been so hard, I think, to get attention for this? I think partly that whole sense of we Japanese are middle class has made it very hard to accept as your own that you yourself might be in peril, you yourself thinking that you're solidly middle class. Apparently, when Prime Minister Koizumi made the pitch that Japanese were paying too much in taxes, many people who were in the, let us say, let me for the sake of convenience translate 100 yen at $1, in the 70 to 80,000 yen dollar a year income bracket thought that they were the ones paying too much in taxes, but that's not so, in fact. But it kept, it worked to keep them hanging on to their middle class identity. So Prime Minister Koizumi was particularly brilliant in obscuring what was going on. He was also brilliant, I think, in his East Asian politics, in the very flamboyant exercise of going to Yasukuni Shrine and revving up nationalism that way. Whereas, in fact, privatizing the postal service in the name of efficiency and so forth and so on was actually opening up the savings of ordinary citizens to global investment. So while putting many ordinary people at risk in terms of their financial security, he was making it hard to see that by taking on the more spectacular issues of honoring our war dead, and it has to be at Yasukuni on August 15th, and to hell with the Chinese if they complain. The blue light, as many of you may have seen this very recent article, the Yamanote-sen, the Loop in Tokyo decided to install these LED lights at its stations. The articles all said there is no evidence whatsoever to prove that blue keeps people from committing suicide, that blue is somehow thought to be, but people are saying blue is a peaceful color, probably causes them to calm down and therefore not jump down. I can think of other ways that might more directly prevent suicide, but I suppose it's a cheaper solution, and I suppose it's an economic issue that it's inconvenient to have people jumping into the platforms. I can understand that. But it's a terrible, I think, a terrible sign of the times, and terrible that this is a way of dealing with it. Okay, so what are let me point out one thing. On the right-hand side is one of Amamiya Karin's books. This is a slogan of the Precariato movement, Ikisasero. It's kind of a strange verb formation, as you can say. It's an imperative form, but with a verb ikiru, right? So it's not let us live. It's not asking anyone, help us live. It's a command. You make society such that we can live. It's a very interesting slogan. About the youth and their the youth who have been turned into nomads, as it were, but refugees, but maybe nomadic is better. The people who, if they're the luckier ones, can spend a night in an internet cafe, and then I've noticed then there's another McDonald's is another place. It's cheaper than an internet cafe. You can get something for 300 yen, but the McDonald's have barriers on the metal hoops so that you can put your head down straight, but you can't shift your body very much, so not as desirable as an internet cafe. Okay. This is what the one-person unions these are the kinds of people who have been brought into a labor movement. On the left, the woman in the center, Yamagami Ai, was a temp worker, managerial type for what's called the, I don't know this line, the baby line. I hear there's a shop in Colorado, the baby line of Lolita Fashions. And she was let go, she thought, unlawfully. And she was, like so many people, she thought, well, she had no recourse. She was just going to have to take it. But then she went online and found out that there was a union she could join as a single worker in Kobe. She did. And she found many of her clients willing to support her. And so now she's become a labor activist. And you can find, if you look her up online, you can see study sessions with all these young women in their variously frothy kinds of Lolita fashion attending labor study groups. The other one is from this summer, Kappa Kuta, cabaret clubs, sort of expensive place, the current incarnation of the Hostess Bar, sort of high-end sex trade, marginally sex trade. This is a case where one of the hostesses, well, the work conditions are horrendous. If you're sick, terrible deductions from your pay. If you're late, deductions from your pay. Manager was sexually harassing her. Her pay, she was owed a lot of back pay. And so she joined one of these unions, and they decided to have a labor action at this particular Kappa Kuta. It's a blurry image. Many of these it's hard to get a good image on the internet because people's faces are blurred for their protection, I guess. And Amamiya Karin herself went there. She said, there we were, many of us clearly not looking well off, right? Because why else would you be in such a union? And they all knew it was a manager's birthday, so they bought a birthday cake, and they went in singing happy birthday to the manager. They're very inventive, which is a great thing about this movement. And people were blinking, and the customers were blinking in the dark and decided they didn't know what was going on, but they joined in singing happy birthday too. And then the woman who got up to stood in the middle of the floor and said, "Stop sexually harassing me and pay me my back wages." And Amamiya on her blog said, I've been at this scene where people who felt they had no rights, no claims to be treated with dignity, suddenly awaken to their rights as a human being and as a worker. And every time it happens, no matter how many times I witness it, it thrills me and makes me shiver to the core of my being. So they did that. They got out. The cake was returned to them, so they had a meeting outside enjoying the cake. And so this action goes on. So people who, in any case, in the days of the most robust days of the labor movement, who would never have been involved in labor action, are finding recourse in these unions that you can join as a single person. Number of them associated with the Japan Communist Party, and many of them also not. So there's a whole range of them all over the country. It's absolutely, it's not enough, everyone will tell you. For some people, the point is to get the current Democratic Party to re-regulate labor, to reintroduce regulations, other kinds of answers, solutions that are resolved. But in any case, what's happened, I think, is that the crab cannery ship, kanikosen, which was one of the 10 popular words last year, came in number 8, and that bookstore clerk whom I mentioned received the prize amongst all these other fancy people. That term, that title itself, has become a name. It's named a condition people couldn't name before. And it's been enormously effective as a metaphor. We're on a cannery ship. We have no rights. We're abused, but we can come together. So even though at first, as the prize-winning entry said, we don't work in the same place and it's hard, having this metaphor, this thing to call our condition, I think has been enormously effective in getting people to seek others who will protest with them and give them legal advice. These are recent stagings of, on the left, the cannery ship. There was one revival at the Hayuza in Roppongi this year. This one is a cheap one in something called the Milk Hall. I don't know it. This is a play that I just saw by Inoue Hisashi, probably the most distinguished living playwright today. So there are contradictions, right? Plays cost a lot of money to go to. Who can afford to go to these plays? I think one of the things these plays are doing is to get the middle-class audiences who can afford to see them to think about these issues. You see a lot of pretty faces on the poster to the right. Well, these people's fans, young fans, then get caught up in the issues that are raised. So in a way, I think that this is a way, particularly theater is important because you see these actors in front of you and you read their blogs, and the actors themselves who previously almost entirely had no interest or knowledge of this writer or this work, becoming more and more, they're being penetrated by these ideas and words and actions. I don't have any pictures, but there are now 4 manga versions, new manga versions of the novel. There are 2 new manga versions of Marx's Capital. And so all of this, there's kind of been this explosion of publication, films and theater, revivals of the old movie as well as this one. I think that human beings need to feel in order to know. And I think that's where this dramatic and literary production is very important. I don't know what the right solution is for this situation, but I think there's something really crucial about joining the struggle for peace. All the peace activists, the Article 9 activists, it's a tremendous movement until North Korea started acting up. I think that's something Japanese peace movement has to come to terms is does anyone just have to whisper North Korea and we're going to be defeated? That needs to be thought through and overcome, I think. But often peace activists, I think, have tended to be solidly middle class or retired people. So it's taken a long time to connect up with the economic justice movement, but it's crucial because so many of Kobayashi Yoshinori, you may remember him, the manga person who was really inflaming passions about the Greater East Asia War and against Korea and China. So many of his readers, it turns out, fans, are people who are on the margins of society. And moreover, in this left-hand image is a new, calls itself a pan-left journal of young people, and you can see from the graphics it is very much directed at young people. I think he was being strategic, but it is true that war historically has been the most reliable solution to economic distress, so that has to be taken on. And I want to leave you with the struggle that's depicted in Kobayashi Takeshi's one of his second to the last novel, which was published after his death, widely censored. It was in a gas mask producing factory. This is I could just find that little bit of the factory in Gotanda in Tokyo and the gas masks that were being produced. The war on the Asian continent, Manchuria had already been invaded. The war on the Asian continent meant that all these workers who hadn't been able to find a job were hired as temp workers. You know, there were 2 and 3 shifts to produce gas masks, to produce parachutes, so forth and so on, war equipment. What the movement that's described in here is really, its ambition is enormous. It's trying to say to the permanent workers, show solidarity for temp workers. For the temp workers to say, you might be grateful for the war because it got you a job, but you can't because the war is even more damaging. So it's a kind of what seems like a structurally impossible thing to get the temp workers and the permanent workers to stand up for each other, to together protest firings after the quotas had been met, and for all of them to protest Japan's war on the continent. Because that is not where our interests lie. We will only be exploited. A wonderful novel, which I hope will get read, too. And let me leave you with a parting image of war and economic justice. At the very end of the struggle in Korea, before a civilian regime came into place, Korean intellectuals had been reading a lot of leftist works. They were getting them a lot through Japanese translation. And these 2 men, whom I met last year, One is a translator, one a publisher. And while translating Lenin and Marx, the translator said, I really need some literature. I need some literature too. I need some literature. The theory alone won't do it for me. And he landed upon Kobayashi Takeshi's works and translated about 3 of them. And then as soon as it was safe to do so, they were published. And they were finally identified many years later, and they were invited to a gathering at his birthplace, at Takeshi's birthplace. And this was, at first they were worried that when the Japanese activists came to find them, that they were going to be sued for not having gotten permission and paid for translation rights. And they wanted to say, hey, no, we don't have to pay you anything anymore. But that wasn't it. The point was really to celebrate the solidarity that had taken place without anyone knowing it. Okay, I've gone a bit over my time. I hope that we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Field. We do have a few minutes for questions. Would anybody like to? Yes, sir.
What do you know about
There's a microphone for you there, so.
Oh, okay. What do you know about the Japan's occupation of the Shantung Peninsula in August of 1914?
Only that happened, but not much beyond that. I think it's part of first of all, we can go back to the Sino-Japanese War of 1898, and the way Japan gets the colony of Taiwan at that time. And I think there's a series of expansionist moves from that time. So I can only situate it within that. I'm sorry. Maybe you can tell us.
Oh, maybe, but I just, when they stayed there, they chased out the Germans, and they stayed there and occupied the peninsula, pretty much. Then the war, they sent mass units to France, along with China sent laborers. There were Chinese camp followers with Pershing, and they did a lot of nice things and kept the friendship going between the U.S. and Japan. Then my understanding is that the Japanese came up with some kind of petition that they floated or let the Chinese middle management like Governor Thompson and Edgar and Blagojevich and Quinn and those people. And they signed this with some kind of promise of gold, and a number that they assigned to this project is $150 million, something like an Enron deal or WorldCom or Global Crossing, those kind of arrangements. And they brought to the Versailles Treaty a paper that had all these names, and they presented it to Wilson and his aide, Colonel House, and Wilson asked the English about it, and they claimed to know nothing, although their spies said they knew about this 6 months ago. The same thing with the French. And Wilson was so preoccupied with, I understand, keeping the French on board, that he figured that because they're neighbors like the U.S. and Mexico or the U.S. and Canada, there should be no problem if the Japanese were allowed to remain in the Shantung Peninsula.
Well, I think it's true that the Western powers are deeply involved in Japanese colonial and imperial expansion in Asia, and certainly the annexation of Korea too. So yes, I mean, I can well understand that. I misspoke earlier and talked about the Sino-Chinese-Japanese War, the first one, 1894 to 95. The thing that I think that it's interesting is that Japan did benefit from its very marginal participation in World War I. I suppose one of the happier parts of that is that the German POWs taught their neighbors how to brew beer, which seems to be part of why Japan has great beer. But it's certainly my writer was very interested in pointing out and protesting Japanese imperial expansion. So thank you for your input.
Just a little bit more.
I think we should take another question.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
I'm curious if
Just a sec. There's a microphone coming.
I'm curious if Kobayashi Takiji, if his work is also drawing the attention of scholars, literary scholars in Japan, or sociologists, or is this really just kind of a popular culture movement that he's attracted the attention of?
No, it's definitely drawing the attention of scholars. Again, forgotten for a long time. And yes, there's a special issue of there have been two special issues devoted of the prime academic literary journals devoted to him and his comrades' writings, and I think there will be more. There have been several symposia, international symposia, 2 in Japan, 1 in China, and last year at Oxford. So definitely, it's more and more an academic phenomenon as well.
Why do you think the Chinese have an interest in?
Oh, because the Chinese now?
Yes.
Partly drawing on a legacy, right? That there was interest in him when he was alive and around. In fact, Lu Xun, many people from around the world sent in telegrams and messages of condolence when his death became known, and one of them was from Lu Xun. So that the notion, the understanding that Lu Xun was interested in him is one kind of hook still. I think that it interests, well, I mean, you can understand that Chinese who were interested in overthrowing or doing something about China's fractured state would be interested in this international movement of solidarity at that time. There were a lot of collaborators. There was camaraderie among China, Japan, and Korea of the Proletarian Movement. So there's that. And I'm not quite sure what prompts people today to re-explore that legacy. I hope that it also speaks to some extent to the forms that the high-growth economy is taking in China today, but that remains to be seen.
Is there another question?
Yes. Just regarding the comment you made about the postal office, I wasn't sure. Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Oh, what it did, what the thrust of it was?
Yes.
Even though Japan's postal system is costly, but anyone trying to ship books back and forth across the Pacific knows, it's also very efficient. And there was a lot of competition from private carriers like Black Cat and others. So in some ways it was puzzling why Prime Minister Koizumi chose that as the hallmark of of reform. You know, when he came into office earlier, he said that he was interested in reform without sacred barriers. So he wanted to small government, deregulate, the classic steps of deregulation. The postal campaign, the campaign against the public ownership of the postal service was puzzling for many people. And I think the most convincing explanation, which is the one I referred to, is the one that, you know, that the post office was also worked as a bank for people. It was a place where many ordinary citizens took their savings. And to privatize that, I mean, the privatization was done in multiple parts, and certainly wasn't completed, and the Democratic Party has a cabinet minister dedicated to redoing that, to undoing that. I don't know to what extent that will happen. But I think the heart of it was that the part that made it worthwhile for Koizumi to stake so much on it was to privatize that pool of savings, which was an enormous pool. And that's how I'm also convinced that he went to those great lengths and ended the parliamentary session, called for new elections, and succeeded.
Just to continue on that, I kind of find it a little bit funny to talk about it because we are in a Federal Reserve Bank.
I know.
I'm one of those Tokyo banking representatives working for a bank. I mean, we look at it, we're a private bank, we look at it as the postal office being probably the biggest competitor that is competing in a totally different, they're not regulated, but also if there is some kind of systematic failure, I mean, the impact it could have would ricochet through the entire Japanese economy like something you would never see.
Right. And I, bow to your expertise on this, but I think I would understand it as somewhat analogous to privatizing Social Security here. That yes, the yield is not very high, but it's steady. And to open it up to the fluctuations of the market represents an enormous risk for citizens who don't have other ways of saving and expecting some return. So I would say that's the counter argument. What also happened is that the postal office, as you know, in Japan is an empire of sorts. It also runs public rest homes, places where people, like, your ward in Tokyo might have a nice spot in Karuizawa, other places in Nagano that you as a small-time worker would have no access to, but you could go with your kid and have a great weekend. Well, since it was privatized, many of those facilities have been sold off at unconscionable prices. And so, that was public property. It was held in public trust. And probably, I think, that part will be reversed by the current administration. So we're talking about a huge public endeavor, a public institution that was then privatized.
I think we have time for one last question. If not, I'll ask this question. One of the things that caught my attention was when you said the cannery ship was first translated in the 30s. Could you tell us a little bit about who translated it and who read it?
It's really interesting. It's one of the first anthologies of modern Japanese literature, and it's called The Crab Cannery Ship and Other Japanese Stories, as if this were in some way representative. But it is an anthology of proletarian literature. It was published simultaneously in New York and London by international publishers, which was the publishing arm of the Communist Party International. They published, it was part of the John Reed Clubs, where so many American workers gained their origins or gained their beginnings as writers, Richard Wright, for example. So it was part of that kind of endeavor. I didn't know who the translator is labeled anonymous, is identified only as anonymous in that translation. I think it was a Russian person, subsequently identified, really when this whole movement to revive his works began. Who read it? Lots of people read it. People were interested in this. And that book closes with a message saying, let us make March 15th International Culture Day for Workers in honor of our fallen comrade. These works produced within the movement were translated into a number of languages and read around the world in a way that we can't believe today. And hard to believe that, for example, many of you know Kinokuniya booksellers, right? Kinokuniya booksellers was the new kid on the block in Shinjuku, and the way they got a leg up on their older, more established competitors was to sell the works, to carry the works of Kobayashi Takiji and others. And they knew that the police would come at noon to confiscate. So people knew the days of the month when the new issues of the journals would come. And they get there early in the morning. The workers at Kinokuniya would be out there early in the morning. By the time the police came, all the copies were sold. So it was mainstream, as well as distinctly communist affiliated. So both.
Well, thank you very much for your talk, Dr.
Thank you very much.